Prime Minister Mark Carney is laying out his plan for Canada to be its own best customer. Today, the Prime Minister revealed more details on the Liberals' Buy Canadian policy as they try to use federal dollars to boost demand for tariff-strapped Canadian industry.
The world has become more dangerous and divided, and that decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship between Canada and the United States is over.
Something seismic unfolded tonight in Ottawa. Not the routine theater of politics, not another press statement wrapped in diplomatic phrasing, but an event that could redefine the balance of power across an entire continent. In front of a room packed with journalists, cameras clicking in bursts. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't simply present a budget. He declared the end of an era that had defined North America for decades. His words were calm, deliberate, and absolute, carrying the weight of a shift that reached far beyond economics. Because tonight, Canada told Washington, without anger, without apology, that it no longer needs permission to lead its own future. It began like any other announcement. Carney approached the podium with his usual restraint, the kind that gives no hint of what's coming. He called it a budget presentation, but within minutes, the tone changed. The careful politeness vanished. The message that followed would travel far beyond that room and echo through trading floors, diplomatic offices, and the corridors of Washington. He started with a phrase so ordinary it almost slipped past unnoticed. "It's official," he said, but the pause that followed, the precision in his delivery, transformed it to something else entirely. What had started as quiet economic reform had turned into something that sounded like a declaration of sovereignty. Then the sentence that froze the room: Canada's future is no longer tied to Washington's decisions. It was not defiance for the sake of spectacle, and it was not the language of negotiation. It was clarity, spoken without hesitation, and it carried the force of a nation redefining its place in the world. For generations, Canadian leaders have balanced caution with cooperation, careful to preserve the partnership that has shaped North American trade. But this time, Carney didn't sidestep the truth. He confronted it head-on, marking the moment Canada stopped orbiting around American policy. For months, he had been warning that Washington's unpredictability came with a cost. Every tariff threat, every midnight policy reversal, every erratic tweet that rattled markets, each was another brick in the wall he was quietly building, a structure designed not to isolate Canada, but to shield it. Dependence had turned into risk, and risk had become unacceptable. What emerged today was the culmination of that realization. While Trump's team played its familiar game of chaos and confrontation, Carney was constructing something far more intricate. He wasn't trying to beat Trump at his own strategy. He was building a new one entirely, one where the American game no longer mattered. At the center of this new strategy stood the initiative called Build Canada Homes. To most, it sounded like standard domestic policy: construction, jobs, infrastructure. But Carney explained it with the kind of detail that hinted at a deeper purpose. The plan called for a new federal organization capable of transforming housing development into a self-sustaining industrial ecosystem. By leveraging public land, large-scale financing, and advanced factory production, Canada would be able to reduce building times by half and cut costs by nearly a fifth, while slashing emissions at the same time. Those figures were impressive, but what truly mattered wasn't the math, it was the message. This was not simply about providing homes. It was about creating an economy that no longer relied on American resources, American investors, or American goodwill. For decades, Canada had waited for capital to flow from the South, for approval through trade agreements, for signals from Washington that shaped its own economic direction. That waiting ended here. To make the point unmistakable, Carney reached backward through history and drew a line connecting Canada's past to its future. He spoke of Indigenous nations and explorers who once built vast networks of trade, stretching across the continent long before the United States had even begun its westward march. It wasn't a history lesson, it was a reminder. Canada had thrived before America existed as an industrial power. And if it could do so then, it could do so again. Trump's brand of nationalism thrives on conflict, on the idea that every gain must come at someone else's loss. Carney's version of patriotism pointed in the opposite direction. It wasn't built on grievance or suspicion. It was rooted in self-respect and confidence. Then came the initiative that turned heads across the financial world, the Buy Canadian policy. To outsiders, it sounded like a slogan, but what Carney unveiled was a structural re-engineering of how federal spending would function from this point forward. Every government dollar, from infrastructure to defense contracts, would now default to Canadian suppliers first, not as a preference, as policy. He laid it out systematically, almost like a blueprint. New homes under the Build Canada program, the Alto high-speed rail project, the National Defence Investment Agency. Every single component built, supplied, and operated primarily through Canadian companies, with Canadian materials and Canadian workers. For years, American corporations had dominated Canada's supply chains, drawing profits north while keeping control firmly in U.S. hands. Those days, Carney said without saying, are over, because once Canada stops importing American materials, tariffs lose their power. A threat is only effective if the other side still needs what's being withheld. Carney quietly removed that need, and in doing so, erased Trump's leverage. But he wasn't finished. After laying out the new foundation, Carney offered the country a choice. His delivery was calm, but the weight of it hung heavy in the air. There were two paths ahead, he said. One followed the old economic rules: cut spending, cling to outdated models, and wait for growth to trickle down. But the other demanded courage, massive investment, structural change, a refusal to be defined by dependence. He paused for a moment, then drew the line in the sand. Canada, he said, must choose the second path. And then came the phrase that captured the spirit of the entire event: we choose Canada. Three simple words, but they carried the gravity of a nation reclaiming its narrative. In that instant, every comparison to Trump's America First strategy became clear. Both framed as acts of sovereignty, but built on entirely different emotions. Trump's nationalism rested on fear, on the idea that everyone else was taking advantage. Carney's vision was grounded in belief, the conviction that Canada could stand on its own. The journalists in the room weren't expecting what came next. One reporter asked about New Brunswick's forestry industry, a sector deeply tied to American markets. Nearly 3/4 of its exports go south, the journalist reminded him, and Washington's trade restrictions threaten billions in revenue. It was the perfect setup for a defensive answer, but Carney's response revealed the essence of his new strategy. He acknowledged the facts clearly. Yes, much of the province's industry relied on American demand. Yes, the U.S. was closing its markets. But instead of retreating into worry, he laid out a plan that treated the problem as an opportunity. First, expand domestic production through Canadian procurement. Second, diversify trade partners across the globe. Third, reimagine the forestry sector itself, transforming raw materials into higher value products that could compete anywhere. None of those solutions required approval from Washington. And then came the line that reframed the entire relationship. We'll negotiate with the Americans, of course, Dash. He said, but we're also prepared to do other things they need in exchange for what we need. That single sentence revealed the deeper genius of his approach. Trump had long treated tariffs as weapons, assuming dependency made every other nation vulnerable. Carney had flipped the equation entirely. The more Canada could operate independently, the more leverage it gained in every negotiation. He summarized it with quiet precision. The United States had changed its interpretation of trade rules, creating a radically different environment than any seen in modern history. The word radically echoed twice, an intentional rhythm meant to drive the point home. The world had changed, and Canada was no longer playing by the old NAFTA-era rules. Trump may have broken that system with his chaos, but Carney had built something to replace it. Then came the numbers that silenced even the skeptics. A $1 trillion investment plan. It wasn't framed as a stimulus or a bailout. It was a statement of capacity. The funds would be directed toward housing, infrastructure, clean energy, artificial intelligence, and national manufacturing, each one reinforcing the same central idea that Canada's economy would no longer depend on the tides of American politics. Carney's delivery never shifted from calm to fiery. He didn't need to. The message carried its own force. We'll have as many jobs as possible in forestry, he explained, but far more in housing, energy, and manufacturing across the country. Translation: Canada would no longer fight over crumbs from Washington's table. It would build a new table entirely. And then, almost casually, he said the line that captured his entire vision. At its core, these are all things we don't have to ask permission for. We control them. We decide. It's our future. There was no triumph in his voice, no applause line, just quiet finality. It was the tone of a leader speaking from a position of certainty. He ended with a reflection that sounded more like a promise than policy. We'll spend less time talking about what the Americans are doing, he said, and more time building this country. The subtext was unmistakable. Less attention on Trump's moves, more focus on Canada's growth. And with that, he delivered what might be the most devastating line of all. That's the end of Trump. He wasn't talking about a political career or a presidency. He was forecasting the end of Trump's influence, the collapse of the system that thrived on keeping allies dependent and uncertain. Because Carney understands something fundamental about power. It doesn't come from forcing others to need you. It comes from not needing them at all. Trump built his leverage on the illusion of indispensability, using economic coercion to bend others to his will. That approach worked only as long as no one could function without him. But what happens when a nation decides it can? That's the moment when power shifts. Carney's policies, Build Canada Homes, Buy Canadian, the trillion-dollar investment plan, aren't temporary measures designed to outlast a single U.S. administration. They are permanent structural changes that will carry forward no matter who occupies the White House. Trump could win another term or fade from the political stage entirely. It no longer matters, because the Canada Carney is constructing will stand independent of that outcome. And perhaps that's the most strategic element of all. Carney never attacked Trump directly. He didn't insult him, didn't mention his name in anger, didn't personalize the conflict. Instead, he built a system that makes Trump irrelevant. One press conference, one declaration, one quiet revolution disguised as a budget. Mark Carney didn't need to argue or provoke. He simply showed what leverage looks like in the modern world. Because in the end, leverage belongs to whoever needs the other side least. Trump needs control over Canada, but Carney has proven Canada no longer needs Trump. Stay tuned. This story is only beginning. What do you think about all this? Tell us in the comments. Before you leave, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you in the next one.